Hello friends, I am Dr. Naresh Kumar, Department of English, Ghatsila College, Ghatsila. In this video lecture, today I am going to address the students of MA English Semester 3, especially those who have opted Indian English Literature as one of their optionals. Here, I wish to discuss today a poem by Nissim Ezekiel, who is a very significant poetic figure in Indian English literature. As you all know, that Indian English literature is an important component of your syllabus, and you also understand its significance, and therefore you have opted it as one of your optionals for your PG course. Before I start my lecture, I would like to make a request. I would like all of you to have the text Poet, Lover, Birdwatcher before you, so that you would be able to follow my lecture properly. You would be able to understand things in their proper context. Nissim Ezekiel is an important modern poet in Indian English literature. Actually, modern Indian English poetry starts with him, and it was he who founded this school, this mode of poetic writing. Nissim Ezekiel was born in 1924 on 16th of December. He was by birth, by ancestry, a Jew. He was born in Bombay, and he studied literature. Actually, he stood first in Bombay University in 1947, and because he secured first position and first class in the university, he was awarded R.K. Lagu Prize. And because of that prize, he had an occasion to pursue further studies. But first, as soon as he passed the examination, he joined Khalsa College, Bombay as lecturer, and he served there some time. But thereafter, he went to England for higher studies, and he spent there 3.5 years. Though his main preoccupation in England remained literature, but he showed keen interest in painting, in drama, in cinema, and he also had an opportunity to study under the great philosopher Joad, under whose guidance he studied psychology and philosophy. Remember, Joad is the same philosopher whose book Guide to Philosophy is famous, which you can find in PDF form free on Google. So after having spent 3.5 years in England, he decided to return to India in 1952. But he demonstrated his first potential for a poet in England itself. And in 1952, when he was in England, he published his first book of verse with the title A Time to Change. Incidentally, that book was also published by an English publishing house. 1952 was a very fertile period for Nissim Ezekiel, and that year he published the poem book A Time to Change, and he also joined a respected Indian magazine, the Illustrated Weekly of India, as an assistant editor. And incidentally, he also happened to marry that year. His wife's name was Daisy Jacob. Thereafter, for several years, he kept working for different publications as an editor, as journalists. Apart from working with the Illustrated Weekly of India, he also edited the Indian Pen, Quest, Imprint, and Poetry India. I told you in the beginning itself that he was the one who made modern Indian English poetry possible. But the question is, how did he do it? He did it in two ways. Number one, by writing a new kind of poetry himself, and second, by publishing poetry written in this new mode. As you all know, that an editor is also a great critic, because an editor receives a large number of requests for publication, but no editor can entertain all the requests, all the articles, all the poems sent for publication. So he has to select a few, the best ones. So Nissim Ezekiel, for all his literary magazines, he selected some important, significant poems, and by making those selections, he was able to encourage a new kind of poetry, which we all know, modern poetry. And we cannot think of modern poetry without the contribution that Nissim Ezekiel made towards it. One of the features of Nissim Ezekiel's poetry is that you would find that in his poetry there is an ironical relationship, a kind of contradictory relationship between three stages of life. One, the day-to-day existential life. Second, the moral life, the moral world. Existential world, day-to-day existential world, moral world, and the spiritual world. Now, it would be very difficult to say anything about Nissim Ezekiel's preference, whether he preferred the day-to-day existential life, or the moral world, or the spiritual world. Actually, he seems to be recognizing the value of all these three worlds. And he also recognizes a kind of ironical relationship between all these three. He was a great craftsman. And in his poetry, you would find that he takes great care to select a particular word, to compose a line. And this is actually the features of almost all modern poets. They are very careful. They are not spontaneous. They don't believe in the so-called romantic school of versification. Okay, so all modern poets are craftsmen, and it is because of this that one finds it very difficult to understand a modern poem in first reading. But once you are able to uncover its primary layer, then you begin to enjoy it. Okay, the poem that we propose to discuss today is a poem in two stanzas. I have already told you poet, lover, birdwatcher. Remember, he does not use the word end, and generally one gets confused about its title and one has a tendency to call it poet, lover, and birdwatcher. Remember, in the title there is no end. Poet, lover, and birdwatcher. Perhaps he wants to give all these three a kind of their independent existence, a kind of autonomous existence. Anyway, the poem has two stanzas. Each stanza consists of 10 lines. So in all you can say that the poem has 20 lines. Now this title reminds one of the metaphysical conceit, where the poet would use a simile which compares two ideas or two objects which don't seem to be having anything in common on the surface. And here also, if you look at the title, poet, lover, birdwatcher. So at first glance, you won't find anything common between poet, lover, and birdwatcher. And this is the element of surprise that he wants to give to his readers, okay, by discovering a common ground between these apparently dissimilar things. Poet, lover, birdwatcher. Let's see the lines. I have already told you that in order to follow me in this lecture, you have got to have the text before you. So if you're not having it, okay, pause your video, get the text in front of you, and then follow me. Okay. The line goes like this. The poem starts, to force the pace and never to be still is not the way of those who study birds or women. To force the pace and never to be still is not the way of those who study birds and women. Here, of the three ideas or the three objects, poet, lover, birdwatcher, he addresses two, women and birdwatcher. And he says that anyone who wants to study birds or women cannot force their ways. That is, they cannot afford to be impatient. They cannot afford to be restless. Generally, we all have this weakness that we want to have the results at the earliest. So anyone who has who is restless about the goal, about the target, cannot achieve such a high goal. Because if one wants to study birds, or if one wants to study the nature of women, one has to have patience. It's not that you want to study a bird, you rush to the bird, and the bird would be lying still there and you will understand it. No, it's not possible. First of all, you will have to show your patience. You will have to wait for the bird to come near you, or you will have to go to the bird in a very stealthily manner so that the bird is not able to notice you, so that your presence does not create any kind of fear in the mind of the bird or the woman. So the poet says that a bird watcher and one who wants to study women cannot force their way, and at the same time they cannot afford to be restless. So one has to have patience. One has to have patience to allow the bird to feel friendly, to allow the women to feel friendly and intimate, and then let them reveal themselves. That's why patience is required. Now he says the best poets wait for words. Beautiful line. Here he says that the best poet does not try to write poetry at will. No, no great poet can do it. Well, there are poets who write poetry on demands, but such poetry is not great poetry. Great poetry requires a great deal of perseverance. A poet has to wait for the right moment, right occasion, right idea. Only then the poet is able to clothe right idea and right moment into a good poem. So if he makes any kind of haste, he will not be able to produce good poetry. Look, these three lines actually remind me of a Hindi couplet that कारज धीरे होत है काहे होत अधीर समय पाए तरवर फले केतक सींचो नीर. कारज धीरे होत है. Things happen slowly. Things happen at their own place. And don't be restless. Don't be restless. Because the tree will bear fruit only at the right time, no matter how much water you pour into it. So watering too much might sometimes give a negative result, a result which you didn't want. So here the best poets, the great poets actually wait for the right moment, right occasion to come so that great poetry can be written. Here it seems that Nissim Ezekiel is in agreement with the famous definition of poetry given by William Wordsworth, where he says that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. It has to be spontaneous. It cannot be forced. So, as long as the poet is not having that spontaneous and powerful feeling, the poet cannot write poetry. So here, the poet seems to be in agreement with Wordsworthian definition of poetry. But at the same time, he does not hand over everything to spontaneity. Here he says that a poet has to have perseverance, the poet has to have patience, so that such a moment comes and he is able to grab that moment, grab that idea, grab that imaginative thing which is required for versification. The hunt is not an exercise of will, but patient love relaxing on a hill to note the movement of a timid wing. He says that the desire to write a poem, the desire to write, the desire to understand a bird, or the desire to understand a woman, or the desire to make a woman understand the request for love is not something which is a kind of hunting. No. Hunting is a kind of thing which you force on somebody. This is not that. The hunt is not an exercise of will. Okay. So if this is hunt at all, then this is not something that you can do at your will. Instead, a birdwatcher, a lover has to wait and relax on a hill for a long time to allow the birds come, to allow the intended woman come, so that they can have a friendliness, they can have a relationship, they can have mutual trust, so that they can reveal themselves to each other. To note the movement of a timid wing. So, in order to note down the movement of a bird, the behavior of a bird watcher has to relax and wait for the bird to come onto a hill. He cannot chase a bird, then the bird would fly away. And then the bird watcher will not be able to observe its behavior at all. Until the one who knows that she is loved no longer waits but risks surrendering. So, a bird watcher, a lover, has to wait long. A bird watcher and a lover has to wait so long as they are convinced that the bird watcher and the lover are not going to harm them. Rather, they have such a faith in themselves that they would surrender before them. The bird would surrender before the bird watcher. The woman would surrender before the lover. But such an occasion needs great amount of patience, great amount of perseverance. In this, the poet finds his moral proved, who never spoke before his spirit moved. And if a poet does this, if a poet behaves like this, then he can say with pride later on that I have not written even a single line of my poetry at my own will. I had no line in the poem is forced one. This a poet can claim only when he has written after demonstrating a great deal of perseverance. The slow movement seems somehow to say much more. The slow movement of the bird watcher. The slow moves of a lover say a lot. It speaks about their sincerity. It speaks about their commitment to their target. It speaks about the amount of patience that they have. So it speaks volumes about their ability. To watch the rarer birds, you have to go along deserted lanes where the rivers flow in silence near the source. He says that if a bird watcher wants to see a rare bird, then the bird watcher has to go to a rarer place where very few bird watchers have gone. The bird watcher will have to go to the source of the river, which is rarely visited by ordinary human beings, or by a shore remote and thorny, like the heart's dark floor. Similarly, the bird watcher might have to visit a seashore which is very thorny, very difficult to go there. And by implication, the poet here says that a poet also, if he wants to say new thing, some great thing, then the poet will have to go to the origin of the idea. The poet will have to enter the inner recess of the heart. The poet says, the heart's dark floor. Now, it is difficult to read what is there in the heart of somebody. Now here the poet is using the word adjective. The heart's floor is dark. So it is not easily for an ordinary poet to reach there to understand what is lying in the heart. But a sincere poet, a great poet, tries everything possible to reach there and to understand what is lying in the heart, what constitutes the essence of human nature, what constitutes the essence of humanity. If a poet understands this, if a poet is able to understand this, analyze this, he is able to write great poetry. And there the woman slowly turned around, not only flesh and bone, but myths of light with darkness at the core. And if a such thing happens, if a lover is also able to read his beloved in that manner, he is able to understand and read the heart and mind, or rather the soul of his beloved, then the beloved would surrender herself before him. And this surrender will not only be of flesh and bone, but also of soul. Myths and light with darkness at the core, and sense is found. So, if such a thing happens for the lover, the nature of the beloved becomes something which can be easily understood. If such a thing happens, the poet is also able to understand man and the humanity that lies within his soul, and then every meaning becomes clear, crystal clear. By poets lost in crooked, restless flight, the deaf can hear, the blind recover sight. And if a such thing happens, then even the deaf start hearing things. Even the blind can recover light. Here, this deafness and blindness are not physical deafness and blindness. Okay, one can have physical eyes, but one cannot understand the reality around him. So if such a poetry gets written, such a poem gets written, then the reader is able, even if blind, the reader is able to see everything. As it happens in the poetry of Surdas. Surdas was a blind poet. But his blindness does not come in the way in describing the beauty and charm of Lord Krishna's childhood. How was he able to do it? He was able to do it by meditating long, with patience, with perseverance on the nature of human being, on the nature of childhood, and he waited for the right idea. He waited for the right words. He waited for the right conception of poetry to come to him. He never tried to force himself on writing a poem. Any poet who tries to pace his way cannot be a good poet, cannot be a great poet. Friends, this poem is actually an example of meta poetry. This poem is not just about our existential world. This poem is about poetry. So you can say it's poetry about poetry. That's why I use the term meta poetry. Meta poetry means poetry about poetry. So in this poem, we get the idea of how a poet should conceive his idea, how a poet should use his craftsmanship, how a poet should transform his conception into a well-formed poem. Now, all this happens, but it requires personal efforts on the part of the poet. It requires patience, it requires perseverance, and it requires a sentiment that in which the person concerned never gives up. because the person who gives up is the one who feels restless. So here he is cautioning, the poet is cautioning all, poet, lover, and birdwatcher, that if you wish to achieve what you have set your goal, then you must show patience. You must have perseverance. Actually, although the poet has three words in its title, poet, lover, birdwatcher, but in my understanding of the poem, he wants to share his thoughts on the way great poetry is written. In my understanding, he wants to give us a peep into the minds of the great poet. So primarily, this poem is about poet. This poem is about poetry, and in order to explain the profession of a poet, Nissim Ezekiel has used lover and birdwatcher as similes. Because if he had not used lover and birdwatcher, perhaps we would not have been able to understand how a great poem gets written, how a great poet communicates his thoughts to his audience, to his readers, how an ordinary poet becomes a great poet. He becomes a great poet by great deal of patience and great deal of perseverance. Friends, this poem, as I have already told you, is in two stanzas, each consisting of 10 lines. But if you look at the structure of each line, then most of the lines are having 10 syllables, but not all lines have 10 syllables. There are few which have 11 syllables, and there are a few which have 9 syllables. So the poet has not made it compulsory for him to distribute each line 10 syllables, though his target was that. But he doesn't allow this technical binding to stop his natural flow that was coming to him after a great deal of patience and perseverance. The poem does not have any difficult word. The poem does not have any difficult phrase, because that would not have served his purpose. His simple aim was to explain the profession of a poet, the job of a poet, by using the simile of lover and birdwatcher. And he did it by using simple words, simple phrases. So transparency, lucidity, felicity of phrases, are the virtues of this poem. And these virtues are achieved by labor, by efforts, by perseverance. So in my view, this is though a small poem, but a beautiful one by Nissim Ezekiel. Thank you.